I have told this story maybe 40 times now, and every time I tell it, somebody at the table goes quiet in the same place. Not the loud part. Not the part where the station screamed and the lights went out across 40 decks at once. They go quiet later near the end, when I tell them about the old man and the cold and the thing he did with his hands. So let me start before all that. Let me start with the morning nobody knew was the last normal morning, because that is how these things always begin. Quietly, with somebody complaining about the coffee. My name is Vale. I am Thren if that means anything to you, which it probably does not, so I will say it the way the humans used to say it to be funny. I am the tall blue one with too many fingers. I worked the lower docks on Cassin Reef, Deck 31, mooring and seals, which is a fancy way of saying I made sure the big ships did not rip the station open when they came in too hot. I was young then. I want to be honest about that. I was young, and I thought I understood strength. I thought strength was a thing you could measure with a gauge, like pressure or thrust, or how much a clamp could hold before it sheared. I was wrong about almost all of it, and the person who taught me I was wrong was the oldest human on the station, a man named Elias Mott, who weighed about as much as a wet coat and could barely climb a ladder without stopping twice. But I am getting ahead. Let me set it down for you the way it was. Cassin Reef was old. You have to understand that first. It was not one of the bright new transit rings you see in the recruitment feeds, all clean light and humming order. It was a relay station, built 3 generations back, parked in a long, lazy orbit around a gas giant called Tovik, which is a brown, sullen, ugly world the size of a bad mood, and Cassin Reef hung over it like a barnacle on the belly of something dead. We refueled ships. We patched them. We let crews stretch their legs and lose their money and start fights in the gallery bars before they pushed on into the deep lanes. 11,000 souls lived aboard, give or take, from maybe 30 different peoples. You heard 9 languages just walking to your shift. You smelled 40 kinds of food and at least 4 kinds of fear, because there are always people on a station like that running from something, and you learn the smell of it after a while. The station was dying slowly even before the bad day. Everybody knew it. The reactor ran hot. The grav plating flickered on the outer rings, so the old hands walked with a little hitch in their step, ready for the floor to drop a half second of weight out from under them. The air recyclers wheezed. Management kept promising a refit that kept not coming, because Cassin Reef was at the wrong edge of the wrong sector and nobody important wanted to pay for it. We used to joke that the station was held together by tape and stubbornness and the prayers of people who did not believe in anything. We laughed about it. That is the part that haunts me now. We laughed. I want to tell you about Elias Mott before I tell you what happened, because if I tell you what happened first, you will picture him wrong. You will picture some hero. Some hard-jawed soldier type from the human war stories, the ones they tell about themselves, the ones the rest of us half believe and half think are exaggerated. He was not that. Elias was small. He was bent. He had skin like old leather left in a window, brown and creased and spotted, and his hand shook a little when he held a cup, and he had a cough in the mornings that sounded like something coming loose. He was, by his own count, 91 Earth years old, and he told me once that on Earth that was very old and out among the stars that was nearly impossible, because the radiation and the bad gravity and the recycled everything wore humans down fast, and most of them did not see 80 out here. He had seen 91. He said it like a small private joke he was playing on the universe. He lived on Deck 29, 2 below me, in one of the long-term cabins, the cheap ones, with a bunk and a chair and a little wall screen that mostly showed static. He had been on Cassin Reef for 19 years. Nobody knew exactly why. There were stories. There are always stories about a man like that, a man who keeps to himself and watches everything. Some said he was hiding from a debt. Some said he had buried a wife somewhere and could not go back to the place she was. Some said he had been a soldier in one of the old human conflicts, the ones from before they came out into the wider galaxy, the wars they fought against each other on their own little blue world, which the rest of us found both barbaric and strangely impressive. that a species would practice killing each other for 10,000 years, and then walk out into the stars and be surprised that they were good at surviving things. I never asked him which of the stories was true. I think that is part of why he talked to me. I did not pry, I just brought him things. That was how it started, him and me. About a year before the bad day, I was hauling a crate of seal gaskets down the Deck 29 corridor, taking the long way to avoid a supervisor I owed an explanation. And I saw the old man sitting outside his cabin door in a folding chair, watching the corridor traffic go by like it was a river, and he was a man on a bank with all the time in the world. He had a cup of something. He raised it to me, not a wave. Just a small lift of the cup, the way humans do, an acknowledgement, I see you, you are a person, carry on. And I do not know why, but I stopped. I think I was tired. I think I wanted somebody to look at me like I was a person and not a pair of hands. We talked about nothing. The weather, which on a station is a joke, because there is no weather, there is only the climate control failing in different ways. He told me the air on Deck 29 had smelled like burnt sugar for 3 days and nobody would tell him why. I told him it was the scrubber on the secondary loop, and it would smell like that until somebody important smelled it too, which would be never, because important people did not come down to 29. He laughed at that. A real laugh, dry and short. And he said, "You are honest, and most people here lie to an old man because they think it is kind. I would rather have honest." So I gave him honest. For a year. Whenever my route took me near 29, I would stop, and we would talk, and I learned the shape of him without ever learning the facts. I learned that he drank his coffee black and bitter, and rationed it because the good beans cost a fortune that far out. I learned that he slept badly and watched the corridor at strange hours. I learned that he had a way of going very still and very quiet when a particular kind of person walked by, the loud kind, the dangerous kind, the kind that did not know they were dangerous yet, and I learned that this stillness was not fear. It was the opposite of fear. It was a man measuring. I did not have a word for it then. I have one now. He was assessing the room. He never stopped doing it every minute of every day, so quietly that you would think he was half asleep. He was the most awake person I have ever known. He told me one thing about himself once that I think about constantly now. We were watching a ship come in, a big freighter badly piloted, and the dock crew were swearing and the clamps were screaming and everybody on the deck was holding their breath, and Elias just watched it, calm as still water, and I said, "Does nothing scare you, old man?" And he was quiet for a while. And then he said, "Almost everything scares me. I have been scared my whole life. The trick is not to stop being scared. The trick is to stop letting it have a vote." He said, "Fear is just a passenger. You can let it ride along. You just do not let it drive." And then the freighter docked clean, no harm done, and he finished his coffee and went inside, and I stood there on the deck feeling like he had handed me something heavy, and I did not know yet what it was. I am telling you all of this so that when the bad day comes, you understand what was already inside him. Because what he did was not a sudden thing. It was the end of 91 years of practice at a single skill, the skill of not letting fear drive. And the rest of us only got to see the last of it, the bright last burning of it, and we called it strength because we did not have a better word. Now the bad day. It was a Tovik shadow cycle, which is what we called the long dark when the station's orbit took us behind the gas giant, and the sun was eclipsed for 19 hours and everything ran on the reactor and the lights and the recyclers and nothing else. Shadow cycles were normal. We had them every few days. People did not love them, the long dark pressing on the viewports. But they were routine. I was on shift on 31. We had 3 ships moored and 1 inbound, a passenger transport, the Marin Tide, carrying about 400 souls bound for the inner colonies, and I remember thinking it was a tight schedule and the inbound was running early and that was going to be a headache. It was not a headache. It was the thing that saved 400 people, the Marin Tide running early, though none of us knew it yet. The first sign was small. The light stuttered. Not the dramatic kind of stutter, just a flicker, the kind we saw twice a shift on the outer rings, and I swore under my breath and tapped my console and thought nothing of it. Then the grav plating dropped, just for a second. The whole deck lost its weight, my stomach floated up into my throat, the loose tools on the bench drifted, and then it came back hard, slammed everything down, and a wrench cracked the deck plate where it landed. And I stood there with my hearts going fast, Thren have two, in case you did not know, and I felt both of them, and I waited for it to settle. And it did not settle. The station made a sound I had never heard it make. A station has a voice. You live aboard one long enough, you know its voice the way you know a person's breathing. Cassin Reef's voice was a low hum, a thrum in the bones. The reactor and the air and the spin all blended into one constant note that you stopped hearing because it was always there. That note changed. It dropped. It dropped like a held breath let go, like the whole station exhaled and could not find the air to inhale again. And every Thren on that deck froze, because we feel sound in our chest cavities, and that sound was wrong in a deep animal way, the way a held breath is wrong. Then the alarms, all of them, not the orderly cascade of a drill, where one alarm leads to the next in a sensible chain. All of them at once, every system screaming over every other system, a wall of noise, and the deck lights went to emergency red. And somewhere far off through the structure I felt a thud, a deep heavy thud, the kind you feel in your teeth, and I knew without being told that something enormous had just broken somewhere in the body of the station. We found out later what it was. A debris swarm. Tovik had been shedding ring material for centuries, slow and harmless, and the station's deflectors had handled it for 3 generations. But the deflectors ran off the secondary power grid, and the secondary grid had been on the refit list for 11 years. And that night, a denser stream came through than the failing deflectors could push aside. A piece of rock the size of a transport hit the dorsal spine of the station at a speed I will not bother trying to make you understand. It opened us up. It cut the main reactor coupling and breached 9 decks, and severed the spinal corridor that ran the length of Cassin Reef like a backbone. And in the space of about 4 seconds, it turned a tired old station into a dying one. I did not know any of that on Deck 31. I knew the lights were red and the floor kept losing its weight and the air had started to taste different, thinner, with a metal edge to it, and people were screaming somewhere up the corridor. My supervisor, a Vorish named Tan, was shouting orders that nobody could hear over the alarms. The 3 moored ships were blowing their clamps and pulling away, which was protocol. Save your ship. And I remember watching the Kareth merchant vessel detach and burn hard away from us and thinking, clear as anything, they are leaving and we are not on it. That is the moment the fear tried to drive. I felt it grab the wheel. I have never told anyone this part. I froze. 23 years old, hands locked on the console, and my mind just went white. A white roaring nothing, and I could not move. And the deck dropped its weight again, and I floated up off the floor and hung there in the red light with the alarm screaming, and I thought, with a strange flat calm under all the panic, this is how I die here, like this, useless. And then a hand closed on my arm. A small hand. A human hand with a grip that should not have been possible from a man who shook holding a coffee cup. And Elias Mott's voice, right at the side of my head, low and even and absolutely without panic, said, Vale, look at me. Not the deck, me. I do not know how he got to 31. He was 2 decks down when it started. There was no working lift, the spinal corridor was breached, and a 91-year-old human had climbed up to my deck through the emergency ducts in the dark while the station died around him. And I will tell you in the next part how I learned the answer to that, because it is its own piece of the story. But there he was, holding my arm, pulling my weight gently back down toward the floor, anchoring me with a strength I could not account for, his old face inches from mine in the red light, perfectly calm. He said, your name is Vale, and you fix the seals, and right now I need you, because you are the only one on this deck who knows where the manual airlock overrides are, and I am too old to find them in the dark. He said it like that, like it was simple, like the world was not ending, like he was asking me to help him carry a crate. and the fear which had been driving, which had been steering me straight into a white roaring nothing, sat back down. Not gone. He had not made the fear go away. He had just taken the wheel away from it and handed me something to do with my hands. I said, "The overrides are aft. Deck 31 has 4, and I can find them blind." He said, "Good. Then we are going to need every one of them. And I want you to breathe, because Thren breathe wrong when they are scared. You puff it out and you are wasting air, and there is not going to be a lot of air. Slow it down. In through the chest plates. Hold it. Let it go. There you are. There you are, Vale." And the strange thing, the thing I cannot explain even now, is that an old man who could barely climb a ladder had just become the steadiest thing in my entire world. The floor was failing. The air was thinning. The lights were the color of blood. And the strongest, calmest, most solid object in that whole screaming deck was a 91-year-old human who weighed nothing, who was scared of almost everything, who had simply decided, a very long time ago, that fear did not get a vote. That was the beginning. That was the first minute of the worst 3 days of my life, and the best, if you can understand how a thing can be both. Because in those 3 days I watched the oldest human on Cassin Reef become the strongest person there, and not one bit of it was about muscle, and I have spent the rest of my life trying to be even a little bit like what I saw. Let me tell you what the station looked like dying, because you should see it the way I saw it. The spinal corridor was gone. That was the heart of it. Cassin Reef was built around a central spine, a long pressurized passage that ran the whole length of the station with all the decks branching off it like ribs, and the rock had cut the spine in 2 places, which meant the station was now 3 separate broken pieces that could not reach each other except through the maintenance ducts and the emergency seals. 11,000 people, cut into 3 groups, in the dark, with the air thinning and the cold coming in. The cold. I have to make you understand the cold, because that is the part the others always forget when I tell this story, and it is the part that mattered most. A station is a warm box floating in a place that is colder than anything you can imagine. The reactor does not just make light and gravity. It makes heat. It fights the cold every single second, a war you never notice because it is always winning. And the rock had cut the main reactor coupling. The reactor scrammed, shut itself down to keep from tearing itself apart, which was the right thing for the reactor to do and the worst thing that could happen to us, because the second it went quiet, the war against the cold was over and the cold had won, and it just did not know it yet. It started coming in, slowly, patiently, through the hull, through the breaches, through every surface. The deck plating started to lose its warmth under my feet within the hour. The viewports grew a skin of frost on the inside. And I, being Thren, started to feel it badly, because my people come from a warm world and we do not do well in cold. We get slow, we get stupid, our thoughts thicken like cooling oil. And here is the thing about the disaster that nobody planned for, the thing that turned everything upside down. Most of the peoples on Cassin Reef were warm world peoples. The Vorish, the Thren, the Kareth crews, the little quick Ashiel who ran the gallery shops. We came from warm places and we built warm stations, and we never imagined being cold, not really cold. Not the deep cold of dead space leaking in through a broken hull. The cold did not just make us uncomfortable, it started to kill us. Slowly at first. The old and the young first. And it made the strong slow and the quick stupid and the brave frightened, because cold does that. Cold reaches into you and turns down the lights one by one. But humans came from a world that tried to kill them with cold for half of every year. Humans had spent 10,000 generations not dying in winters that would have ended any of the rest of us in a night. They had this thing in their blood, this stubbornness, this ability to keep their core warm and let their edges go cold and survive it, to shiver and burn fuel and keep going where the rest of us would have laid down. The humans on the station, the few hundred of them, did not like the cold either, but it did not stop them. And the one it stopped least of all, the one who walked through that freezing, dying station like it was a brisk evening, was the oldest human there, Elias Mott, who had, he told me later, grown up in a place on Earth called the Steppe, where the winters were a kind of slow, patient murder, and who had learned before he was 10 years old how to not die in the cold, and who had apparently never once forgotten it. I think that is the cruelest, funniest joke in the whole story. We had spent a year, all of us on 29 and 31, being gentle with the old man, slowing down for him, helping him with crates he could not lift, watching him cough and shake and ration his coffee and seem, every single day, like the most fragile thing on the station, the one a strong wind would carry off. And when the disaster came, the disaster that broke the strong and froze the quick and frightened the brave, it could not touch him. The thing that killed us was the thing his whole species was built to survive, and he was the oldest and most practiced of them, 91 years of surviving, and so the most fragile-looking person on Cassin Reef became, almost overnight, the strongest one there. But I am getting ahead again. I keep doing that. Let me go back to the deck. So Elias had me. He had taken the wheel from my fear and given me a job. And the job was the overrides, because here is what he had already understood in the first 60 seconds, what it took the rest of us hours to understand. The station was venting. The breaches were pulling air out into space, and the automatic seals were failing one after another because they ran off the same grid as everything else. And if somebody did not start closing the manual overrides, deck by deck, hand by hand, then in a few hours there would be no air left to be coaled in. We were not just fighting the cold. We were fighting the slow leak of everything we needed to breathe. And the manual overrides, the big heavy hand-cranked emergency seals that did not need power, that some long-dead engineer had insisted on installing 3 generations ago over the objections of people who said they would never be needed, were the only thing that could stop it. I knew where they were. Every SEAL tech did. We had been trained on them and we had laughed about them because who hand cranks an airlock? What is this? The Dark Ages. Elias did not laugh about them. Elias had walked into a dying station, and the first useful fact he wanted from me was where the manual overrides were, because he was a man who had spent 91 years learning that the old crude things, the things that did not need power, the things everybody laughed at, were exactly the things that saved you when the clever new things failed. We got to the first override together. It was aft behind a panel, a wheel the size of my chest, stiff with 19 years of never being turned. And I want you to picture this. I want you to really picture it. The deck is red and screaming. The floor keeps losing its weight. The air is thin and getting thinner. And a 91-year-old human and a panicking young Thren are standing at a giant rusted wheel, and the human braces his feet and spits on his hands, actually spits on his hands, an earth thing, and he says, on 3, Veil, and you are stronger than me so you do most of it, but I will keep it from slipping back. And we turned it. It would not move, and it would not move, and then it moved. A screech of metal, an inch, then a hand's width. Then it broke free and spun. And somewhere down the corridor a seal slammed shut, and the wind that had been pulling at our backs, the thin, awful wind of the station breathing itself out into space, stopped. He leaned on the wheel a moment, getting his breath, that loose-sounding cough rattling in him. And he looked at me, and there was sweat freezing on his face already in the new cold, and he smiled. A real smile. And he said, 3 more on this deck. Then we find the stairs down and do 29. And then we keep going until we run out of decks or we run out of us. He said, you with me, Veil. And I, who had been frozen white and useless 10 minutes before, who had thought this is how I die, useless, I said yes. Because how could you not? How could you look at that and not say yes? That was the first hour. 11,000 souls aboard, the station cut into 3 dying pieces, the reactor dead and the cold coming in and the air leaking out. And somewhere up in the docking arm 400 more on a transport that had arrived early and was now trapped against a station it could not safely leave. And down on deck 31, an old man who weighed nothing was teaching a frightened young one how to breathe, and how to turn a wheel, and how to not let the fear drive. There was so much more coming. There was the long climb down through the dark. There was the gallery where 300 people had crowded together in the cold and the panic, and what Elias did when he walked in among them. There was the child we found, and the thing the cold had nearly done to her, and the thing he did to stop it. There was the choice, the terrible choice, near the end, about the reactor and the 400 on the transport, the choice that should have killed him and would have killed any of us. I will tell you all of it. But this is where the first part has to stop, because this is where it really started, with a hand on my arm and a calm voice saying, "Look at me," not the deck me, and a fear that sat back down and let an old man drive. I told you they go quiet near the end, the people I tell this to. They are not quiet yet. Right now, if you are like the others, you are thinking about the cold and the wheel and the old man spitting on his hands. Good. Hold on to that. Because the next part is the long dark, and the dark is where you really find out what a person is made of. And what Elias Mott was made of was something I am still, all these years later, trying to find a word for. We finished the 4 overrides on 31. We sealed our piece of the station against the leak. And then Elias Mott looked down the dead stairwell into the dark of the lower decks, and he tightened the worn collar of his coat, and he said the thing I think about most of all, the thing that started everything that came after. He said, "All right, let us go down and see who is still alive." So we went down into the dark. I have to tell you about the dark first, because if you have never been in it, the real dark, you think you know it and you do not. On a station, there is no real dark. There is always something glowing. A panel, a strip, a screen, the soft amber of a standby light. You live your whole life in a low, constant glow, and you forget that the universe's natural state is black. When the reactor died and the emergency cells started to drain deck by deck, the dark came in behind the cold like its brother, and it was total. It was the dark of the bottom of a sea. You put your hand in front of your face and it was not there. And in that dark, the alarms had finally gone silent, not because the danger was over, but because the systems that made them had no power left. And so on top of the dark, there was a silence that was almost worse, the silence of a thing that has stopped breathing. Elias had a light. Of course he did. A little hand crank lamp, an old crude thing, the kind that did not need a charge, the kind you wound up with your fingers, and it gave you a thin yellow beam for as long as your hand kept turning. He had pulled it from a kid in his cabin on the way up. He told me, the way some people grab their valuables in a fire. His valuable was a lamp that worked when nothing else did. I asked him later why he kept such a thing, 19 years on a station with power to spare, and he looked at me like I had asked why he kept his own teeth, and he said, because someday there is no power. He said it the way you state a fact about the weather. Someday there is no power. And I thought about all the years he had carried that small certainty around inside him, while the rest of us laughed at the hand-cranked seals. And I felt the first edge of understanding what kind of person I was dealing with. We went down the stairwell. Threns see a little in the dark, better than humans. So I went first and he came behind with the lamp, one hand on my shoulder, his breath loud and rattling. And every few flights he had to stop and lean on the rail and cough that loose terrible cough. And I would wait, and I would feel the cold coming up the stairwell from the lower decks like a tide coming in, and I would be afraid. And he would feel me being afraid through his hand on my shoulder, and he would say, "Slow your breath, Vale, we have time." And we did not have time, but he said it, and somehow having him say it made it a little bit true. Deck 29 was where his cabin was, where I had stood 100 times in better days drinking bad tea and talking about nothing. It was unrecognizable. The cold had got into it. The corridor was rimed with frost, the frost growing on every surface in feathery white, the breath of dying systems freezing as it touched the metal. And there were people. That was the first time I understood the scale of it. Not just the station, not just a number, 11,000 souls, a number you cannot feel. People, crowded into the corridor, huddled together. The warm world peoples already going still and slow in the cold. Mothers holding children, old ones laid out and not moving. And the sound, the low sound of a few hundred frightened beings trying not to make sound, which is its own kind of sound, and I will hear it until I die. I froze again. Not the white roaring freeze from before, a different one. The freeze of seeing too much to fix. And Elias felt that too through his hand, and he did the thing he would do over and over in the next 3 days, the thing I think was the truest strength in him. He made it small. He could not fix the station. He could not save 11,000, so he did not try to. He found the one thing in front of him that he could do, and he did that, and then he found the next one. He shrank the impossible down to the size of his own 2 hands, and he just kept working at it. He raised the lamp and he raised his voice, and his voice in that frozen corridor was not loud, but it carried, the way a calm voice carries through panic better than a shout ever could. He said, "All right, listen to me. I need everyone who can still stand to come to the middle of the corridor. We are going to share our heat." He said, "You, and you, the big ones, the Vorish, get up. We are going to put the small ones and the cold ones in the middle and the big ones on the outside. And we are going to make a wall of bodies. And we are going to be warmer together than we are apart." He said it like a man who had done it before. And I learned later that he had. That on the step of his childhood, the way you did not die in a blizzard was you gathered the herd and the people into a tight knot. And you let the cold have the outside, and you kept the heart of it warm. He had been doing this his whole life. He had just never expected to do it in the dark belly of a dying station, 19 light years from the world that taught it to him. And the people moved. That is the thing about a calm voice in the dark. People are so desperate for someone to tell them what to do that when a steady voice says do this, they do it. And the doing of it is itself a kind of warmth, because a moving body is a hopping body, and a hopping body does not lie down and let the cold take it. He got them into a knot. He got the big slow Vorish on the outside and the small failing Ashiel in the middle, and he got the warm bodies pressed together, and the corridor changed. You could feel it change. It was still freezing. It was still dark. But it was a group of people doing something instead of a group of people dying, and the difference between those 2 things is the difference between everything. That is where I first saw the child. She was Ashiel. The Ashiel are small, smaller than a human child, quick darting people with big dark eyes, and they come from the warmest world of all of us, a hot bright planet, and the cold was killing them first and worst. She was maybe 6 years old in their counting, and she had been separated from whoever she belonged to in the panic, and she had crawled into a gap behind a service panel the way small frightened things do, into the smallest darkest space she could find, which is exactly the wrong thing to do in the cold, and by the time the lamp found her she was barely moving. Her big eyes were half shut. Her breathing was slow. The cold had reached into her and started turning down the lights one by one, and she had stopped shivering, and if you do not know what that means, I will tell you. When a body stops shivering in the cold, it is not because it is getting warmer. It is because it is giving up. It is the beginning of the end. I had no idea what to do. None of us did. The Ashiel near us were too far gone themselves to help, and the rest of us did not know enough about cold to know how bad it was, and I remember the awful helpless feeling of looking at this tiny half-frozen child and having nothing. No tool, no training, no idea. Elias knew. Of course he knew. He had probably watched the cold try to take a child before on the step in a winter 90 years ago. He moved faster than I had ever seen him move. He got her out from behind the panel, and he did not do the thing you would think to do. He did not rub her arms and legs to warm them. And when I started to do that, he caught my wrist hard and said, "No, never the limbs. You push the cold blood back into the heart and it stops. You warm the center first, always the center." And he opened his own coat and he opened his own shirt and he put that tiny freezing child against his own bare old chest, skin to skin, and he wrapped his coat around the both of them, and he held her there against the one warm thing in that whole frozen corridor, his own 91-year-old body, and he talked to her. Low and steady. Nonsense mostly. The names of stars. A song with no tune. He talked to her the way you talk to keep something from slipping away. A steady line of voice for her to follow back up out of the cold. And he rocked her a little, and he held her, and we all watched, and nobody breathed. It took a long time. It felt like hours. It was probably not hours. And then the child shivered. I will never forget that shiver. The rest of us would have wept to see a child shiver because shivering is misery, shivering is cold. But Elias, when she shivered, let out a breath like a man setting down a great weight, and his old face cracked into something that was almost a smile, and he said, quiet, to her or to himself, I do not know, there you are, you came back. Because the shiver meant her body had found the strength to fight again. The lights were coming back on inside her one by one. He had reached down into the cold and pulled a child back out of it with nothing but his own body heat and 90 years of knowing exactly how. And I watched a thing I did not have a word for, and I have been looking for the word ever since, and the closest I have come is this. I watched the oldest, frailest, most fragile-looking person on Cassin Reef be the strongest one there, because strength, I was learning, is not the thing that lifts the most. Strength is the thing that does not let go. Her name was Sephi. She told us later when she could talk in that piping little Ashiel voice. Sephi. She had a way of saying Elias' name that none of us could match, a little trilling thing. And from that hour on she would not leave his side. She rode in the crook of his arm through everything that came after. This tiny warm-world child who should have been the first to die and instead became the thing the old man was protecting. And you could see, when he carried her, that she had become his reason, that whatever else broke he was not going to let go of her, and somehow that made him stronger still. I have noticed that about the brave ones. They are bravest when they are carrying something. Now I have to tell you about Cask, because every story like this has a Cask in it, and if I leave him out you will not believe the rest. Bren Cask was Kareth, and the Kareth are big. Bigger than Vorish, twice the size of a human, slabs of muscle and armored hide, a warrior merchant people, and Cask was the station's chief of security, which on Cassin Reef mostly meant breaking up bar fights and looking large, and he was good at both. In normal times Cask was fine. I had no quarrel with him. But the cold and the dark and the dying do something to certain people, the same way they did something to Elias, except the opposite. Where the disaster reached into Elias and found 90 years of practice at not letting fear drive, it reached into Cask and found a thing that had always been there under the muscle. A thing that said, when it all comes apart, you save yourself and the ones like you and you let the rest go. Cask had pulled together the strong ones, the security, a knot of big warm world people, and they had taken the one part of the station that still had heat. There was a section near the old reactor housing. The maintenance core that was still warm would stay warm for days off the residual heat in the reactor mass even though the reactor itself was dead. And Cask had taken it, and he had sealed it, and he was keeping it for himself and his and a few they had chosen. And he was not letting anyone else in, because, he said, and I heard him say it, there is only so much warm and so much air and we cannot save everyone, so we save who we can. And who we can is us. You can almost understand it. That is the terrible thing. In the cold and the dark, with the math of air and heat against you, Cask's logic was not insane. It was just small. It had shrunk down to the size of his own survival and stopped there, where Elias had shrunk down to the size of his own 2 hands and then kept reaching out. One more person, one more, never stopping at the edge of himself. We came to Cask's sealed door with about 60 people behind us. The ones we had gathered, the warm knot we had kept alive through 2 decks of dark, and the small ones were failing again and we needed the heat, the real heat, the reactor core heat, or they were not going to last the night. And Elias walked up to that door with the child Sephi in the crook of his arm, this little bent old man, and on the other side of it was a Kareth twice his size with a stunner and 3 more like him. And I thought, this is where it ends. This is where the old man finally meets a thing he cannot outcalm. I was wrong. Elias did not shout. He did not threat. He stood at the door and Cask's voice came through it telling him to go, telling him there was no room, telling him the warm was for the ones who could hold it. And Elias listened to all of it patiently, the way he had listened to me complaining about the air a year ago. And when Cask was done, Elias said, in that calm, carrying voice, You are right that we cannot save everyone." And there was a silence because nobody expected him to agree. And then he said, "But you are deciding who, alone in the dark, scared. And that is the worst possible person to decide it. A scared person alone in the dark." He said, "Open the door and let us decide it together in the light, all of us. And maybe the number we can save is bigger than you think. Because right now you are one man hoarding heat, and you are going to spend the rest of your life knowing exactly how many you let die through a closed door. And you do not strike me as a man who wants that cask. You strike me as a man who is scared, and there is no shame in being scared. I have been scared my whole life, but you do not have to let it decide who lives." And then Elias did the thing that I think was the bravest single thing I have ever witnessed, braver than the wheel and the child and everything after. He put Sephi down gently into my arms, and he walked up to that sealed door, unarmed, 91 years old, weighing nothing, and he put his hand flat against the cold metal of it, and he said, "I am going to stand here until you open it. I am not going to fight you. I could not fight you, look at me. I am just going to stand here in the cold where you can see me through the port, an old man freezing slowly at your door, and you are going to watch me, and we are going to find out together what kind of man you are, because I already know. I have known men like you my whole life. You are not the man who lets an old man freeze at his door. You just have not remembered it yet." And he stood there, in the cold, the frost growing on him, that loose cough rattling, and Cask watched him through the port. This huge frightened Karath watched an old human refuse to be his enemy, refused to give him a reason to harden, just stand there and freeze and wait and believe out loud that Cask was better than his fear. And I will tell you, it is the hardest thing in the world to keep a door shut against a man who is not attacking it. Anyone can keep a door shut against a battering ram. But against an old man with his hand flat on the metal saying, "I know you are better than this," that door does not stay shut. Not against a person who has any heart left at all. And Cask, under the muscle and the fear, had a heart left. The door opened. I will tell you in the last part what it cost, because it did cost. Opening it was not the end of Cask's story or ours, and the choice that came after was worse than anything the cold had done. But the door opened. The heat came out. We carried the small ones into the warm, Sephi and 60 others, into the residual heat of a dead reactor. And the cold's first great victory of the night was taken back from it by an old man who never raised his voice or his hand, who won the way he did everything, by being the steadiest thing in the room and refusing, simply refusing, to give up on anyone, not the child, not the 60, not even the man who had locked the door. That is the part where they start to go quiet, the people I tell this to, right about here, when the door opens. We were warmed for a while. We were alive, more of us than should have been. And in the warm of the dead reactor core in the dark by the thin yellow light of a hand-cranked lamp, Elias Mott sat down at last, finally, an old man who had climbed and carried and cranked and held and stood at a freezing door, and he let himself rest, with the child asleep against his chest, and he coughed that loose rattle that I was starting to be afraid of, and I sat next to him, and I said the thing I had been wanting to say since the first hand on my arm. I said, "How? How are you doing this? You can barely climb a ladder. You shake holding a cup. How are you the strongest one here?" And he was quiet for a long while, getting his breath, the lamp light on his old creased face. And then he said the thing that I have carried with me ever since, the thing that is the whole story really, the thing I am telling you all of this to be able to tell you. He said, "Vale, I am not strong. I have never been strong. I am 91 years old and most of me has already died a piece at a time over a lot of years. I have buried more people than you have met. I have been scared every single day of a very long life." He said, "You think strength is the thing that does not break. It is not. Everything breaks. I'm held together with scars. Strength is the thing that keeps moving after it has already broken." He said, "The young think they are strong because nothing has broken them yet. That is not strength. That is just luck and youth and time you have not spent. Real strength you only get from the breaking. You get it from surviving the thing that should have killed you and surviving the next one and the next, until you are so full of scars that you are not afraid of the breaking anymore, because you already know in your body that you can break and keep going. He looked down at the child sleeping on his chest, and he said, "The cold cannot scare me because I have already been this cold, a long time ago, on a night when I was younger than you, and people I loved did not make it through, and I did. And I learned the worst thing and the best thing on the same night. The worst thing is that the cold does not care, and the best thing is that you can keep moving anyway. That is all I am doing here, Vale. I am just an old man who already knows he can keep moving in the cold, surrounded by young ones who have never had to find out. That is the only reason I am the strongest one here. I am not stronger than you. I have just been broken more times and put back together more times, and I am not afraid of the next one anymore." And then he closed his eyes, and he held the child, and he rested because he knew, the way he knew everything before the rest of us, that the worst of it was still coming, that the heat would not last, that the air was still leaking somewhere we had not found, that up in the docking arm 400 souls were freezing on a trapped transport with no way down, that before the rescue ships reached us, if they reached us, somebody was going to have to do a thing in the dead reactor that no one was supposed to survive. He rested while he could. He had taught me that too, without saying it. Rest is a weapon. Rest when you can, because you do not get to choose when the next thing comes. You only get to choose how much you have left when it does. I did not sleep. I sat in the warm dark and held the lamp and watched the old man breathe. And I listened to that loose rattle in his chest, and I was afraid of it, and I did not let the fear drive because he had taught me how, and I thought about scars, and about how I had spent my whole young life thinking strength was a number on a gauge, and how wrong I had been, and how the proof of it was sleeping right there in front of me with a child on his chest, the oldest and the strongest, the most broken and the most unbreakable, the same man, the only one. There was one night left, the longest one, and in the morning, if you can call it morning in a place with no sun, Elias Mott was going to stand up and hand me the child and walk toward the dead reactor and ask me to help him do the last thing. But that is the end of the story, and the end deserves its own telling. The heat did not last. He knew it would not. The residual warmth in the dead reactor mass was a fire with no fuel being added to it, and a fire like that only ever does one thing, which is go out, slower than you want and faster than you need. And by the second night, the warm core that had saved 60 of us was cooling toward the same cold as everything else. And the child Sephi had stopped being able to get warm even pressed against the old man's chest, and the small ones were failing again. And I could see in Elia's face that the math had finally caught up with him, the math he had been outrunning with calm and bodies and a hand-cranked lamp, and that the math was about to ask for something the calm could not pay. Here is what we did not know on the first night and learned on the second, when a station engineer named Holt, a human, one of Kask's group, crawled to us through the ducts with the news. The Marin Tide, the passenger transport, 400 souls. It had arrived early, you remember, and it had moored against the docking arm just before the strike. And when the strike came, the arm's clamps had jammed shut on the automatic failsafe, locked the ship to a dying station, and the transport could not detach. Its own engines could not break the clamps without tearing its hull open, and the docking arm was venting heat and air into space through a dozen small breaches, and the 400 aboard the Marin Tide were freezing in the dark exactly like us, except they had no warm reactor core to crawl into, no Elias, nothing but a thinning tank of air and a cold that was coming for them faster than it was coming for us. The clamps would only release with power, a pulse of it, enough to drive the release motors once, throw the clamps open, and let the Marin Tide push off and burn clear to a survivable distance where a rescue ship could reach her. And there was exactly one place left on Cassin Reef that could make that pulse of power. The dead reactor. It was not truly dead. Holt explained it, and I did not understand half the words, but the shape of it was this. The reactor had scrammed, shut itself down hard and safe, but the core still held a charge, a dangerous sleeping charge. And if you went in and physically reset the main coupling by hand, the coupling the rock had knocked out of alignment, the one the automatics could not reach because the automatics had no power, then the core would wake just long enough to throw one pulse down the line before it tore itself apart for good. One pulse. Enough to open the clamps and free the Marin tide, and, Holt said, enough to drive the long-range distress beacon hard enough that a rescue ship would actually hear it. Because the little beacon we had been running on emergency cells was a whisper, and nobody was coming for a whisper. One pulse would save the 400, and call the rescue that would save the rest of us. And the person who reset the coupling would be standing inside the core when it woke. Holt did not have to explain that part. We all understood it. The radiation, the heat. You went in to throw that coupling and you did not come out, or you came out and died slow over days that you did not have, and either way you were spending your life to buy that one pulse, and there was no version of it where you walked away. It was a door you went through one direction. Kask said he would do it. I have to give him that at the end. The big Karath who had hoarded the heat, who had locked 60 people out to die, he stood up in the cooling dark and he said he would go into the core because, he said, and his voice was not steady, I closed a door on these people and I have to open a bigger one, and this is the only one big enough. He meant it. It was real. It was a true thing trying to make up for a false one. And if Elias had let him, Kask would have died a redeemed man, and it would have been a fine ending, and you would tell it that way at the table. But Elias did not let him. Elias was sitting with Sephi asleep against him, and he listened to Kask, and he listened to Holt explain the coupling one more time, the angle of it, the way you had to brace and turn and hold it through the wake-up or it would slip back and the pulse would die. And Elias listened to all of it with that same patient stillness, assessing the room, the way he had every minute since I had known him. And when it was done he said, "No, not you, Kask." And Kask started to argue, and Elias raised one old shaking hand, and the Karath twice his size went quiet, because that is what Elias did to a room. He had done it to me on the first deck, and he did it to the strongest of us now. Elias said, "Kask, how old are you?" And Kask said his years, and they were not many for a Karath. He was young in the long Karath life, decades and decades still owed to him. And Elias nodded like that was the answer he expected. And he said, "I am 91. I have weeks left in me, maybe months, that cough you have all been listening to and being too polite to mention. That is not the cold that has been with me a year. That is the thing that was going to take me anyway, soon, in a bed, slow." He said the radiation in that core would take a year off your life, Kask, or 20 off all the ones who could go in there and live a while after. It cannot take much off mine. There is not much left to take. He said, "You all have years. I have a cough and a bad chest and 91 years already spent. You do not send the one with the most life left through that door. You send the one who is mostly already gone. That is not bravery. That is just arithmetic, and I have always been good at arithmetic. It is the only way the numbers come out kind." And nobody could answer him, because he was right. In the awful way he was always right, the way that came from having done the arithmetic of survival 100 times before in 100 colder rooms. He had assessed this room too. He had seen before any of us that he was the correct one to spend, that of all the lives in that dark his was the one that cost the least and bought the most, and he had decided it, probably hours ago, probably the moment Holt finished explaining, and he had only let Kask speak so that Kask would have offered, so that Kask would carry the offering instead of the locked door for the rest of his long life. He gave Kask that, even then. He gave the man who locked the door a thing to remember instead of the thing he had done. Then Elias did the thing I told you about at the very beginning, the thing the people I tell this to are always quiet for. He lifted the sleeping child off his chest, and he held her a moment, this tiny warm-world girl he had pulled back out of the cold with his own body, and he looked at her face for a while in the lamplight, and then he put her into my arms, into mine, and he said, "You keep her warm, Veil, the way I showed you. Center first, always the center, and you teach her the breathing." And he held my eyes the way he had on the first deck, look at me, not the deck, me, and he said, "You are stronger than you know. You have been since the first wheel. You just needed to break a little to find out, and you have, and you did not let it stop you, and that is the whole thing, that is all strength ever is." He said, "You are going to be the strongest one here after I am gone. Not because you lift the most, because you do not let go." He said, "Do not let go of her." I could not speak. I held the child. I held the lamp. My two hearts were breaking, both of them, and he saw it, and he smiled that dry, short smile, and he said, "Do not be sad. I have been ready a long time. I have just been waiting to find out what I was being kept around for." He said 91 years, and it turns out it was for a wheel and a child and a door and one more cold night. He said, "That is a good ending, Vale. Most people do not get to know what they were for. I get to know." And then he stood up, an old man who could barely climb a ladder, and he tightened the collar of his coat the way he had in the stairwell 100 years and 2 days ago, and he picked up his hand-cranked lamp, the crude old thing that worked when nothing else did, and he turned toward the dead reactor, and Kask, the great Kareth, fell in beside him without a word and walked him to the door of the core, because that was the part Kask got to do, the carrying, and Elias let him have it. I did not see the rest. None of us did. We were not allowed near it, the radiation, and besides he sent us back, told us to get everyone into the suits the rescue would need us alive in, gave us a task for our hands so the fear could not drive. Even then, even at the end, he was still handing us things to hold onto. Holt and Kask were the last to see him at the core door, and Holt told me after, when we were both old enough, that he finally would, what Elias said before he went in. He did not say anything grand. Holt said the old man just looked at the door, the One Direction door, and he was scared. You could see he was scared. He had told me he was scared of almost everything his whole life, and he stood there scared for a moment. And then he said out loud to himself the thing he had said to me on the deck a year before, the thing that was the whole of him. He said, "All right, you can come along, you just do not get to drive," and he meant the fear. And then he opened the door and he went in, and he threw the coupling. We felt it. The whole station felt it. The pulse. The dead heart of Cassin Reef woke for one beat, one single enormous beat, and the lights came up all at once across the docking arm. And far up the structure the clamps blew open with a sound like the station's whole spine cracking, and the Marin Tide tore free and burned out into the dark with her 400 souls, clear of us, safe, away. And the distress beacon screamed across 19 light years. Not a whisper anymore, a shout, a roar, "Here we are alive, come and get us." One beat, and then the reactor tore itself apart for good, and the heat and the light died for the last time, and the cold came back and the dark came back. But the shout was already gone out into space, and it could not be called back, and somewhere a rescue ship was already turning toward it. They reached us 40 hours later. The cold had taken more of us by then. It is not a clean story, I will not pretend it is. The cold does not care, and it took people in those last 40 hours that no calm and no body heat could save, and I will carry their faces too. But it did not take Sephi. I kept her warm, center first, always the center, the way he showed me. I kept the breathing slow. I did not let go. When the rescue suits came through the seals and the lights of other ships filled our frozen viewports, the child was alive in my arms, breathing slow and warm, and a few thousand of us were alive behind me, and 400 more were already safe out in the dark, and not one of us would have been, not one, without an old man who weighed nothing and was scared of everything and would not, ever, for any reason, let go. They never found enough of him to bring home. You do not after a thing like that. There is no grave. There is a name on a list of the lost, Elias Mott, age 91, occupation listed as retired, which is the funniest and the cruelest thing on the whole list, retired, as if the last thing that man ever did was rest. Sephi grew up. The Ashiel live fast and bright, and she is grown now, with little ones of her own, and she carries his name in that trilling way none of us could ever match, and she tells them about the old human who held her against his chest in the dark and would not let the cold have her, and they do not entirely believe her, the way the young never entirely believe the ones who were there, and that is all right. They will find out. Everyone finds out eventually what the cold is, what the dark is, what the breaking is. And when they do, I hope they remember the story, and I hope it does for them what it did for me. I am old now myself. Not human old, not 91, but old for a Thren. Old enough that the young ones on the new station slow down for me and help me with crates and look at me like a strong wind would carry me off. And I let them. And I assess the room every minute, the way he taught me, so quietly they think I am half asleep. And I carry a little hand-cranked lamp, the crude kind, that works when nothing else does, because someday there is no power. And when that day comes, I intend to be the steadiest thing in the dark. The way he was, for whoever needs it, the way somebody once was for me. That is the whole story. That is the part where you go quiet if you are like the others, right about now, thinking about an old man's hands on a coupling in a dead reactor, throwing one bead of light out into the dark to save 400 strangers and a frightened child, and a useless young doc tech who thought strength was a number on a gauge. I used to think the strongest one on a station would be the biggest, the youngest, the one who lifted the most, held the most, never broke. I know better now. The strongest one is almost never the one you would pick. The strongest one is usually the oldest, the most broken, the most scared, the one who has buried the most and lost the most and been put back together the most times, because that is the only place real strength comes from. The breaking and the going on, and there is no shortcut to it, and you cannot buy it or train it or lift your way to it. You can only survive your way to it, one cold night at a time. When the station began to die, the oldest human became the strongest one there. Not because he was hard to break, because he had already broken everywhere, a long time ago, and learned the one thing the rest of us had not yet had to learn. That you can break and break and break, and still not let go.